Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from sunny Frankfurt, and welcome to the second part of the Lufthansa Systems Let's Talk About IT online conference series, Can Partnerships and Alliances Save Airlines? I'm your host, James Liu. Today, we'll be discussing the current state of airline networks around the world, as well as the role of airline alliances and partnerships after the pandemic. We'll start by looking at the current state of the industry and the impact of the coronavirus crisis on the demand in air travel. This is followed by a discussion in airline network recovery and the regulatory environment. Then we'll explore the different scenarios of how airline partnerships will evolve in the post-pandemic world. After that, we will open the floor up to some questions and answers, and the comment box will be open shortly prior to the Q&A session. Before we begin, please note that this Skype call is being recorded and the recording will be available on our website after the session. Your microphones are muted by default. However, you are invited to post your questions in the chat window shortly before the Q&A session starts. If some questions remain open due to time constraints, please feel free to get in touch with us. We're happy to discuss further. Please note that the views and opinions presented here in this webinar are those of our own and do not represent the views of any of our associated companies. And as they say before takeoff, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. Next slide, please. Thank you. Joining me today on the panel, we have Serge Bukovac, our Director Consultant here at Lufthansa Systems. Serge has over 20 years of experience in the areas of network planning, scheduling, and transportation economics. Prior to joining Lufthansa Systems in 2015, Serge held various roles at Qantas in the network planning, scheduling, and freight departments. He has also been a lecturer at the University of New South Wales School of Aviation, and he is a current board member of the German-Australian Business Council. Hello, Serge.
Hello, James. Hello, everybody.
Our next speaker is Jan Never, our Senior Product Manager for Netline Plan here at Lufthansa Systems. Jan has over 12 years of experience in the areas of airline alliances and partnerships, competitive intelligence, and network planning. Prior to joining to Lufthansa Systems in 2018, Jan was a business intelligence and finance manager at Star Alliance, specializing in competitive analysis and partnership models. Hello, Jan.
Good afternoon, James. Good afternoon, everybody.
And finally, a little bit about myself. I'm a management consultant here at Lufthansa Systems. I have 15 years of experience in the network planning, scheduling, and revenue management areas in airlines such as Qatar Airways, Virgin Australia, and Qantas, before joining Lufthansa Systems here in Frankfurt early last year. So let's get started, shall we? What has happened since the pandemic started? Well, unless you've been living under a rock in the last few months, you will surely have noticed that airlines have stopped flying, people not traveling, and instead of being in an office dressed up for work, we're all sitting here at home with our headphones on. Before the world succumbed to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, airlines around the world planned a 4.2% increase in capacity for the year 2020. In May alone, the worldwide ASKs dropped by 72% compared to the same time last year, with Europe and Asia the worst affected. IATA has estimated that in 2020, full-year RPKs will shrink by 50%, and that airlines are going to take a $314 billion loss in passenger revenue. The World Tourism Organization has also estimated a 5 to 7 years worth of growth lost in worldwide tourism visitation. Well, a lot of numbers, but it certainly looks like a little bit like the end of the world as we know it. With all these very depressing numbers, Serge, do you have anything that you can share with us that could potentially lift our spirits?
Thank you, James. Well, maybe we start moving then to the next slide. Look, I promise from here on it's going to be mostly good news. This statement doesn't look very positive, but it's just to remind us that we are actually not there yet. We are still in the middle of pandemic. It is probably safe to assume we'll be in the pandemic for the next 12 to 18 months. It's not going to go anywhere. But
Serge, I said lift our spirits, please.
Absolutely. As I said, only good news from here on. So if we go further with the presentation. Well, when we're talking about alliances and partnerships, look, there are things happening right now that will affect how these will be formed and how they will be reformed once everything settles. It may not be the first thing on everybody's mind right now, but there are definitely things that we have to at least observe. And these are sort of the three questions that I see very important to answer to sort of give ourselves a bit of a context. So the first one is obviously the airline networks. How will they be reassembled? And I use this word on purpose because that's exactly what's going to happen. Something unique happened this time around that hasn't happened in the previous crises. Well, the networks completely collapsed. As this sort of goes on, we might see airlines operating disjointed networks. It's not going to be up to airlines to decide what sort of network they will operate. It may be just domestic network. It may be a separate domestic network, a separate international network. It will be very much dictated by the pandemic, by the infection control, by the regulators. It will be very, very patchy. And it's not going to be a situation where we have a network now that will have to grow. We'll have to essentially reassemble them. And as already mentioned, regulatory environment will be it's a big unknown, as well as a corporate governance. By corporate governance, what I mean is this current situation where we're having massive airline bailouts, governments essentially buying into airlines, which hasn't happened in a long time. This will also affect not only airline networks, but also partnerships. And then, of course, do partnerships actually even make sense in the short term? I guess that's also a critical question that needs to be answered. So if we maybe move along, there are things that there's consensus emerging on some of these things, but not on all the others. One sort of big thing that people agree on, and we're already seeing some data on it, is that recovery will start in domestic markets. That's if you're lucky to have one. Not everybody has a domestic market. There are some inter-regional markets. We're talking within EU and also potentially within Southeast Asia that kind of resemble domestic markets. But if you're lucky to have a functioning domestic market of a reasonable size, then this is where recovery is going to start. International travel will be driven by infection control measures for next 12 to 18 months. It will be very, very patchy and likely bilateral. We've seen Australia and New Zealand currently talking about a travel bubble, and that's probably what's going to be happening elsewhere as well. This is exactly what I meant when I said domestic markets will recover. I mean, if we look at the current data, that's probably, I mean, the situation doesn't look very good there as well. I mean, they collapsed by 55% year on year. It's still a lot better than what we've seen interregionally or intercontinental. So that already supports that. And if we have a look at the next slide, we can actually see that these proportions are changing. This is something that we might actually observe as well, that because people are only able to travel short haul domestically, that the actual proportion of domestic markets, this is now already published schedules, will be a lot greater in comparison with the other two. But if we look at what's actually being published right now, which is on the next slide, we can actually see, sorry, this is one more thing that I actually want to say. This is not necessarily a bad news. Domestic markets are in fact 46% of total passengers. So this is literally half of everybody that's flying. So if the recovery starts in domestic markets, that just might be good enough to get us going for a while in the industry. I mean, domestic markets should not be underestimated. It's not all doom and gloom just because we will not be able to fly internationally for the next few months. And I guess if we look at next slide and see what's currently sort of being planned and published, and I really wouldn't trust anything that's been published in terms of schedules beyond the end of May because airlines simply don't know what's going to happen. But we're definitely seeing Chinese domestic market bouncing back up. We're seeing some really good signs in intra-European markets. One that's a bit of a question mark is the US domestic. They are currently probably just getting to the peak of the pandemic, and nobody really knows what will happen next. But we are seeing that airlines are already looking at lifting up capacity, at least domestically, short haul, and they're publishing accordingly. Anything beyond May, there's a lot of noise in the data. People are really not sure what they're publishing, and in some cases we're seeing airlines still with a full schedule published in the market, but that's not going to happen. So in terms of things that nobody agrees on, and there's no consensus, and this is not because people have differing opinions, but this is simply because nobody really knows, is what this recovery in air traffic is going to look like. Now we're seeing a lot of V curves, U curves, W curves, and there are a lot of scenarios being thrown about, but I personally think what we're going to see this time around is going to be very unique. It's going to be a shape that we haven't seen before, and it may even be a symbol that we haven't thought of. Data actually supports that to an extent, but we can probably guess, looking into the past, what it might look like. And this next graph shows us two instances when we actually had a big upheaval, right? So September 11, we essentially had a regulatory shock that we're seeing right now, when there was an external event when essentially you couldn't fly even if you wanted to, because simply you were not allowed to, right? It was mostly driven by security regulation in those days. What happened in September 11 is, while the RPKs collapsed, and obviously traffic collapsed, GDP didn't really completely collapse. I mean, it decreased, but people still had money to fly. So it wasn't really a shutdown of the whole society, it was just a shutdown of the air travel. And then we saw a reasonably quick recovery after that. And it still took nearly 3 years until we got there, but we saw this sharp bounce. Global financial crisis was a regulatory shock. It was an economic shock. And there we saw what normally happens, which is that air travel then tracked the GDP. What we might see now is some sort of an overlay between these two, because we have both regulatory shock and the financial shock. We might see that first half of the September 11 curve, where pretty much traffic will collapse completely, even deeper than what it was then. But then when it starts going up, it's not going to bounce up as sharply as it did after September. It won't intercept this GDP curve, and it'll just stay there. And GDP is not going to recover that quickly. Nonetheless, it might look like a V-shaped recovery from a distance of few years. That's yet to be seen. I mean, there are some positive signs in the market, and people are now sort of reevaluating their GDP forecasts. It was, yes, everybody agrees we're going to have the recession, but it might be as early as 2021 that we see GDP going back to the same growth rates, and that will then obviously lift the air traffic as well. There's another thing that people also don't quite agree on, and there's a lot of questions here, and that's where we're going to go in terms of regulatory environment. And this is particularly important for alliances. Now, I spoke to an old friend of mine who is actually a regulator, and well, he said, look, until now, regulators haven't been very vocal. You know, I mean, there is nothing to be vocal about. Nothing is really flying, you know, and slots and everything else are not probably that critical at the moment. But at some point, regulators will draw a line and start doing their jobs. And this is very important for the alliances, because there are people who are assuming that going forward, the regulatory environment will be more relaxed because the industry is in distress, and that it will be easier to go into joint ventures and easier to go into, you know, trying to align the schedules and capacity. At some point, regulators will start doing their jobs, and they will definitely draw a line, and they will definitely basically protect the interests of the countries and societies and consumers and the flying public in the way they always do. So I don't think anybody should assume that somehow regulation will go away after all this settles, or even during this crisis, and that we will see some sort of an upsurge in JVs just driven by the fact that it will be now easier to get approvals. That may not happen. Regulators will draw a line. We will in fact see more regulation in some ways. Maybe if we go to next slide, what we're seeing right now, that's sort of pointing in that direction, is what's happening with government bailouts. And here's Air France. They're the first ones that got one. And we're already seeing essentially government saying, well, there will be no more domestic flying in France. And that's, again, a regulatory impact that will probably get more pronounced as the other governments take stakes in airlines. Another thing, now with governments basically buying into airlines, this doesn't necessarily spell spell the end of alliances, but it might actually make them more complex. I mean, I guess these tensions existed for a while now in this particular case, but we're already seeing tensions growing within the airlines that are already in some sort of a partnership, but where one government intervenes in one airline, but the other one not so much in the other. And we will probably see this particular space getting a little bit more complicated as we move along. And I guess the last thing is what the airline networks will look like in the next 12 to 18 months and beyond. Now, the question here, I guess the first question is, are they going to be bigger, smaller, or perhaps same? Jan, maybe you can pitch in here with your opinion.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Serge. I guess we can all agree on that they will be different. Question is to what extent. I would guess at least 12, 18 months going forward, they will be smaller. But again, that's might be something up for discussion.
Yeah, I actually think, I mean, yes, they will be smaller, but their network has several dimensions, right? So there's certainly capacity, and they will be smaller in terms of capacity. There will definitely be less seats in the market. They will also be smaller in terms of frequencies, and that's a function of capacity being reduced. What may not happen, and if we look into the past, there is actually some data supporting that as well. We may not see a significant decrease in number of city pairs served. And if we look into the next slide, which I actually find very interesting, is if you look at the number of city pairs served, they did not really collapse after September 11, and they did not really significantly reduce during the global financial crisis, just a bit. It was a blip, and then they grew quite significantly. So airlines might reduce capacity in their networks, but they might not reduce their network reach. And this actually makes sense because if, when the times are good and, you have these money-making routes, you just pile capacity on them, and this is where you derive most of your revenue. But when the times are bad, you will probably seek, as an airline, to get whatever you can from wherever you can. And having a network spread is probably a good way to do it. So airlines may not actually reduce the number of destinations served. I mean, in fact, we have airlines now that where the whole business model literally depends on the fact that they have many, many destinations that they serve from their hubs. We didn't have these global mega hubs around September 11. So we may not see now a significant reduction in number of destinations served, and this may have significance for the partnerships, because there is an expectation that airlines will seek to extend their reach by entering partnerships, but in fact they may actually seek partnership primarily for a different purpose, which is to fill their planes.
Yeah.
Rather than extend the networks. Yes.
Can I just add something to this? So this is a very, very interesting graph when I first saw it, and it's definitely quite unexpected until you actually put it on paper like this. I suppose with all the airlines in the world, well, those who owns it anyways, saying that they are going to look at retiring the A380, and this includes airlines like Emirates, probably this will support the theory that the number of city fares will actually grow in the medium to long run, because very large sort of A380 size, 747 size aircraft will be retired.
No, that's absolutely correct, and that really reflects that the capacity will be reduced rather than network reach. One other thing that we have now, and we didn't have during the global financial crisis or September 11, are cost-efficient aircraft with sort of medium capacity and a long range. And this now allows airlines to build different kind of networks and potentially also respond a little bit better to this crisis. Maybe if you look at the next slide, this is basically the same. This is the number of unique destinations served from the 3 largest European airports. And of course, we're seeing a massive collapse because nothing is flying in May 2020. But even here, we haven't really observed, apart from these seasonal fluctuations, which are quite normal, we haven't really observed any kind of massive dips in terms of number of destinations served. And mind you, these airports are congested, so that may actually also contribute to that. People are not really pulling out unless they absolutely have to.
So this is, sorry, can I just clarify? This is from May 2020, sorry, May 2000 to May 2020.
That's correct. This is now a 20-year view. This is just to capture basically the crises that have happened in the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. So maybe just to recapitulate and sort of go back to these questions, how will airline networks be reassembled? Well, they will be reassembled from the ground up, starting with domestic markets if you have one. But it may well be that the rest of the network will look significantly different within the next 12 to 18 months. And going forward, this might actually bring about a lasting change to how we build networks. And it might even challenge some business models, particularly hub and spoke models. Regulatory environment will become potentially more, different in any case. It will bring some challenges, especially with the government buyouts of the airlines. Corporate governance will change. But regulators will eventually start doing their jobs. Do partnerships actually then make any sense in the short term? Well, if all you're flying is domestic, then probably not. But we may see different type of partnerships emerging. We may see intermodal partnerships emerging. I mean, look at Europe. If Air France now can no longer fly domestically, and the only way you can travel is high-speed rail, then we might actually see airlines turning towards rail partnerships, at least in that sort of market. If you have a functioning partnership at the moment, if you have a JV, if you have sort of strong code shares, they will probably still bring some benefit in the short term. I mean, it's not like nobody's flying internationally. People still do fly. There's there flights from Frankfurt to Asia and to America as we speak, and from other hubs. So if you have a partnership in the short term, it will still bring you some benefit. It will not be a priority, but there might be a potentially different alternative type of partnerships emerging. And it's definitely probably good to start thinking about what partnerships can contribute in a medium to long term, and this is now something that my colleague Jan will probably update us on.
Yeah, thank you, Serge. Definitely some very interesting points there, especially the one where historically after a major crisis, number of city pairs still keeps growing. That's definitely very interesting. So it has often been said that an airline's network is the backbone of any partnership. Without complementary networks, it would be challenging to form a meaningful relationship between any two airlines. Would you agree with that, Jan?
100%, James. Thank you very much. Thank you, Serge, for the first introduction part. Coming now more to alliances and partnerships topics. And I also want to kick off this section with a quote from Benjamin Franklin dating back to, I think, 1776, so 250 years ago. He said, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we will hang separately." I guess the 2020 equivalent is #we're all in this together. but this obviously is the more eloquent quote. And I think it's the perfect quote for somebody like me, and I guess many people in the audience today as well, who believe in airline partnerships and who also believe in partnerships when times are not so rosy. And actually, if you mentioned I used to work for Star Alliance, and I joined April 1st, 2008, so right at the onset of the global financial crisis. And so shortly I've joined, one of the biggest crises was on its way, peaked in September with the Lehman Brothers collapsing. And obviously I was worried for the industry, but also worried for my job. And I remember having a discussion with one of my senior colleagues who was in the Alliance for quite some time and was working in partnerships before. And he said, I understand your concerns, but keep in mind, usually not so rosy times for the airline industry means good times, better times coming up for airline partnerships. And I think if we look back now since 2008, I would definitely confirm that quote. And again, I think many people who are involved in partnerships will agree. If you don't agree, maybe share that comment later in the comment box. But not only do I believe in partnerships, I also believe in data. So I was trying to see if we can actually back these statement ups that not so rosy times for airlines will usually be followed by fruitful times for airline partnerships. And actually, yes, I found some evidence and data looking back at the last 20 years relationship between operating and codeshare flights. And what you can see on this graph, hopefully you can all see that okay. You can see that during the crisis, September 11, the global financial crisis, you can see that the relationship is pretty stable. It's all indexed to 100 in April 2000, by the way. So quite stable during crisis, but after the crisis, post-September 11 and SARS and post-global financial crisis, we see a significant uptake in airline partnerships. Here again, what we use is codeshare flights as an indicator for partnership activity in the industry. So I think not only anecdotal evidence from the past, but also data confirms that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully it's not the oncoming train, as Serge, as you said. And hopefully this crisis means that airline partnerships will flourish even more once we are out of the, let's say, crisis situation we are right now in. We go to the next slide. I mean, even though partnerships are not the priority at the moment, the partnership world is still spinning, and maybe some of those news have been buried in the corona crisis news, but we have actually a new airline joining an alliance. Royal Maroc joined 1st of April, probably the saddest joining of an airline to an alliance, just a press conference, no ceremony, no nothing. So that happened just about a month ago. At the same time, LATAM left oneworld, now in partnerships with the part of the equity alliance, if you want to call them like this, with Delta. This has happened as well. Slowly, nobody really noticed this. And we also see that Delta, for instance, made statements about their equity partners recently, that they're committed to them, but obviously they're not in a position to financially commit to their partners. So you can see partnerships, even though they are based on equity investment, quite significantly equity investments. For instance, in LATAM, Aeromexico, they will not, they will only go so far, and financial commitments are quite rare these days. I think we can move on to the next slide. I'll touch upon some of the other topics in the next slide. I have three key questions for this section that I would like to address. The first one would be, to what extent will the current crisis, the current COVID-19 crisis, impact airline partnerships in the medium to long-term future? As you said, short-term, there are some partnerships you have, and they hopefully deliver some value, but obviously they're not the priority yet. But hopefully, and everybody should be prepared for this, when we come out of the crisis, partnerships will be more important in the future. So we'll address that question. I also would like to discuss, obviously, somebody who has worked for a global airline alliance. This is a topic very close to my heart. What does the crisis mean for the global alliances, for Star Alliance, for SkyTeam, for OneWorld? Is that, will they survive? Will they maybe even thrive? Or could that actually be that they have to say bye-bye to the industry? They have been under pressure before. Probably pressure will increase. Interesting to discuss this. And then last but not least, quickly talking about airline joint ventures. Are they the better positioned form of partnerships to deal with the crisis and the potential new normal, or whatever that new normal will look like? So what we have done within the team at Lufthansa Systems with the consulting and the network planning experts, we have essentially reviewed the likely crisis-induced industry developments that will happen. So industry developments as an outcome of this current crisis, and we essentially created an inventory of all those that we think are likely to impact the partnerships in particular. In total, we found 8. We have mapped these 8 potential impacts in this matrix here. rating them based on their likelihood. So how likely is it that these developments will happen and what potential impact they can have, both of these axes from low to high. And the first one, which you can see here in the medium-high quadrant, is network scope and scale changes. Serge, you touched upon this topic quite extensively already. Networks will look different. Remains to be seen how different. But James, as you rightly said, networks need to complement each other. Otherwise, airline partnerships can only do so much. And as partners will go change their network, their scope, and their scale, that will have a very high impact on partnerships as we expect to happen. Another one that we have up here is partners going bankrupt. As airlines, unfortunately, go bankrupt, and we have seen the unfortunate cases already, that also means that partners will go bankrupt. And the airline industry, I guess majority of people in the audience from the alliances and partnership will agree, are actually very much interwoven. And on the next slide, we can have a perfect example of Virgin Australia. Virgin Australia, who had unfortunately go into voluntary administration a few weeks ago. And it's like the perfect example how interwoven the industry is. If you see on the left-hand side is the shareholder structure of Virgin Australia. Just a few shareholders, but quite big in complexity. We have Etihad, we have Singapore, we have HNA with Hainan Airlines. And that shows you how, just already from an equity perspective, not even talking about codeshare interlines or something, how interwoven the industry is.
Yeah, it's very interesting to note that there's still quite a few competing interests from a share registry like this, right? With very many airlines holding a similar number of shares, but serving very different markets.
Absolutely. It's a few shareholders, but a very complex shareholder structure. You can see 4 have pretty much equal shares of 20%. Roughly. And of course, Etihad Singapore and Hainan Airlines, as a member of the HNA group, they all serve to some extent similar markets. They're all competing with each other. So
they don't have ATI, they don't have antitrust.
Exactly, they don't have antitrust, so there's only so much they can do in terms of their partnership coordination. So it's probably a very tough situation that we're seeing there. If we go on the right-hand side, the codeshare partners of Virgin Airlines, if you can go back one slide, please. We see 13 partners. This is true as of February this year. Not the greatest amount, just a handful of very valuable codeshare partners that Virgin Australia had. And you can see, obviously, these are all affected from the currently voluntary administration Virgin Australia is going to, and hopefully they emerge out of this even stronger than before. Fingers are crossed. But on the codeshare partner side, we also see some of the carriers that have been in trouble and are currently fighting for survival. And of course, we all hope that most of us make it through. But I think case in point here is the industry is very interwoven. Partnerships are very important. That ranges from very simple, let's say simple interline codeshares all the way up to equity partnerships. And so the crisis will have a significant impact on the industry and the partnerships in particular. And next slide, come back to the metrics. A couple of things. We discussed relaxation of ownership rules in the top left quadrant. What some people are at least expecting or likely to expect is when airlines go out of business and countries will be left with national carriers, without national carriers, or with just insufficient air travel supply, maybe that is finally the time when ownership rules are relaxed. And that, we think, from a likelihood perspective, still not very likely, but let's see how long the crisis endures. Maybe this dot would move more to the right, to the likelihood. But of course, that could have a significant impact, because part of the reason why we have airline partnerships that we have today, alliances, joint ventures, are because of these ownership rules. If they would be relaxed, that could have a very high impact. Probably not in the immediate future, but in the long-term future, that could significantly impact airline partnerships. Increase of regulatory oversight. Serge, you covered this to a large extent. Yes, it remains to be seen. I think we all agree that something will happen. Will it be in favor of partnerships? Will it be easier to enter into joint ventures, or will it be more harder? That remains to be seen. I mean, virtually all forms of partnerships are to some extent regulated and have to get approval. So very interesting to follow what will happen there in the next future. Nationalization and state support, a little bit to the right. Impact expected from our perspective to be medium, but likelihood quite high. I mean, we see that already. This is not looking into our crystal ball. We see carriers discussing support from the states. We see carriers being nationalized. We see, as an example, Alitalia, and it's interesting to see in that regard, or it's already discussed if they really have to be a member of SkyTeam. That was already was brought up for discussion. They have to leave the transatlantic joint venture within SkyTeam, I think end of this month. So carriers will look and probably have to look at their partnership strategy, especially when the government and the states get involved as well, which can have a political impact on the partnerships to be forged in the future.
Definitely.
Another thing, consolidation and merger and acquisition activity is also something that we think is likely to happen, and depending on in which areas it happens and with which partners, it will have a significant high impact on airline partnerships. We have seen the first things happening. I think yesterday or the day before yesterday was announced that Aerolíneas Argentinas and Austral, both state-owned Argentinian airlines, will be merged. So that's, from a partnership perspective, I think not significant impact yet. But of course, we have seen in the past M&A activities that has significant impact, primarily on the global alliances. So when LAN and TAM joined forces, when they merged, TAM left Star Alliance for oneworld. And so now that was obviously the second time that Star Alliance lost a Brazilian carrier after Varig went bust earlier. And now LATAM is leaving because they're working more closely together with Delta as part of the Equity Alliance, and they have decided to remain unaligned, so they will not join SkyTeam from what we understand as of today. So consolidation, M&A activities will have a quite significant impact. And one thing that sits pretty much on the opposite side of the scale, changing passenger preferences. This was actually something we discussed quite extensively internally with the colleagues, and I think we came to the conclusion that we agree to disagree to some extent. But my personal opinion is, yes, in the short term, passenger preferences will change. People will prefer to go direct, even more so than in the past, because that means they don't have to connect at a hub, where obviously you might catch a disease. Although the likelihood is probably very low, but people will, for at least the short-term future, I think, will prefer these. On the other hand, I think in the medium to long-term future, people, and hopefully the pandemic coming to an end, finding a vaccine, but then people will forget about, and people will happily take a detour and fly via hubs if they can save some money.
Yeah, this is the one that I was a bit uncomfortable about. I mean, I believe that this particular crisis has a potential to change the utility function and basically change the passenger preferences. It has happened after 2001. I mean, the security environment became so complex at the US airports that people would rather row a canoe across the Pacific Ocean and then ride on a horse and connect in LA in those first few years. I believe it has actually really changed passenger preferences significantly, and in very, very many ways impacted the partnerships and codeshares that people had with American carriers domestically. There was just very, very strong dislike of having to connect and preference to fly directly. May happen this time, may not.
But yeah. Future will tell us. I think to summarize, so the current industry will definitely be a stress test for all airline partnerships. Specifically, could also be a catalyst for new partnerships happening, and maybe also new forms of partnerships. Interesting topic that we unfortunately can't discuss today, being the time constraint to some extent, is what kind of innovative partnership methodologies like self-connecting, airport facilitated connections would happen in the future. And this brings us to the next question: what does the current crisis mean for global airline alliances? Essentially, with the intelligence that we have gathered from answering the first question, we created a straightforward inventories of opportunities and threats we see for the global alliances, oneworld, SkyTeam, and Star Alliance. And obviously, it's easier to find threats, but we also found some good opportunities that I would like to start with. And obviously, I would say it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, once-in-an-alliance lifetime opportunity to radically reinvent global airline alliances. There have been pressure before. I think alliances will come under more pressure, but now is the time to be, to think big, to be creative, and find a new sustainable niche for the alliances in futures. Partnerships will be more important than they have been in the past. I think this is something we all agreed upon, but maybe you disagree. Please share something in the comment box, which has been just turned on. And another thing which I could foresee where alliances could find a very bright future is the joint digitalization. I mean, we all agree, and the industry has done some good progress, that the airline industry needs to be further digitalized. But of course, that comes with certain expenses, and now obviously budgets will be heavily constrained for the next year. So I think for an alliances, this will mean that they could jointly do it for the members, and essentially it makes sense, instead of 26 carriers, 13 carriers doing this individually, that you do this together. On the threat side, obviously, to the best of my knowledge, all alliances have been or are funded by the member carriers, and right now cash is king, so airlines will try to save as much cash as possible. So the alliances budget cuts, I guess, are likely to happen. Some of the members will probably go bankrupt. So in the past, there was always the quote that the network is done, now is focus on customer and digitalization. Maybe that is not true in the future anymore. Maybe the network has to be reassembled again, as Serge said. We will also see more alliances within alliances. That's what we're predicting. You know, the joint venture creep, as we called it. Joint ventures might be, and that's what we discuss in the next question, be the most equipped form of partnership to deal with the crisis and the new normal. But obviously, that can have a destabilization effect on the existing airlines within the alliance not participating in the JV.
So you're saying that, sorry, just with the joint venture creep, can you just explain that a little bit more?
Yes, so I think what we have, and some carriers openly complained about this, if they're part of the same alliance, but they cannot participate in the intra-alliance joint ventures that have been formed. I mean, they're separate from the alliances, but obviously they are, to some extent, from the customer perception, I would say, are within the alliances, and obviously that leaves them in a less competitive situation if you cannot participate in these joint ventures, which obviously is the highest form, or one of the highest forms of airline partnerships, with the highest complexity, but also the highest benefit.
Yeah.
It could also happen that members leave airline alliances in the future because strategy changes. That's actually something that could very well happen in the future. And we have the rule of three here. The rule of three is a rule of thumb in the industry that you need to have three big players, to have a competitive and level playing field. And I think we see this in the airline industry, but we also saw it in the alliance industry. We have three, and I think if one out of the three would close shop, that could have a very detrimental effect on any remaining on any of the remaining alliances. And then last but not least, non-alliance minded behavior of members. Right now, obviously, it's fully understandable that airlines will do what is best for them, but they also should not forget the partners, and then should plan for also the time after the pandemic is over. So if we have to weight the opportunities versus the threats, we think that the threats are actually a little bit stronger than the opportunities, but still, knowing my former colleagues from Star Alliance and knowing the relevance the alliances have, this means that we will see more of the alliance relevance.
Okay.
Sorry,
go on.
I think we fast forwarded a bit.
Yeah, I think just with the time constraints. I mean, there's a lot of material that we've covered. So thanks Jan, for that very deep dive into the world of alliances and partnerships. So I believe that we have some comments. So guys, the comments section and the question box is now open. Just some comments rolling in. All right, let me read some of these out. So, whoa.
I saw one question regarding low-cost carriers. To what extent they are impacted, and I think this is a very valid question, because to the largest extent, low-cost carriers so far have not participated in partnerships, not participated in interline agreements. There's the Value Alliance, the first LCC alliance, but I think that that could actually, as I mentioned earlier, the crisis could be a catalyst for also new forms of partnerships. And I think obviously partnerships always come with a certain cost and certain complexity, and LCCs don't like cost, they don't like complexity. But I think there are now innovative forms virtual interlining, what is called self-connecting passengers, airports facilitating connectivity among carriers. We have seen EasyJet with the Worldwide by EasyJet product. So I think it could actually be an outcome of this crisis as LCCs will engage more in what you can call partnerships, but it's not the traditional partnerships that we have seen.
Do you think given the business model of low-cost airlines, how is that going to affect their infrastructure, so to speak? A lot of them use different systems and.
Yeah, I mean, business models will be tested by this crisis. Not only the low-cost business model. I mean, low-cost business model, I'm not quite sure how that's even going to function following the. I mean, they will have some advantages, but I mean, they generate their revenue on passenger volumes, right? So it's all about ancillary revenue and having the full planes. If we now have reduced demands, if everybody's hitting only 60% load factors, simply because demand is just not there, and it will be very difficult to also get the ancillary revenue. Or if we are now forced to sort of block out that middle seat, low-cost carriers might have faced some challenges that they haven't faced in the past. I don't give anybody an advantage in this sort of situation. It is very difficult to pick which business model will actually be the strongest. Everybody will have challenges, including the low-cost carriers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've got an interesting one for Jan. One of our audience members has asked, what's the rule of three in one of your earlier slides? Can you elaborate on this term?
Yes, I think, as I mentioned, it's a rule of thumb only in many aspects of the world, but also in the business aspect. And I think we see this in the airline industry. You know, we have 3 big carriers in the US. We have 3 big airline groups in Europe. To some extent, we see that development also in Asia and Africa to happen. And I think if you want to have a functional global alliance world, a global alliance landscape, you need 3 global alliances to be present. Of course, it can also be 4 or more, but I think there's obviously a certain danger if one of the 3 alliances would decide that it's not worthwhile to pursue anymore. And obviously, we all want healthy competition in the industry. And although alliances as such are not airlines, they're still competing, and they're keeping themselves up at night with new innovative ideas that they're throwing out, and then soon after the other alliances follow. So I think we really need 3 global alliances for the global alliance landscape to function.
Thank you for that. I've got one for Serge, actually. So if the number of frequencies on direct services will be going down, will the travel via hubs not be growing instead?
Sorry, what was the second part of the question? Will the
traveling via hubs not be growing instead?
Well, that's it can, right? So it will all again depend on the changing passenger preference. I mean, clearly, hub has an advantage that you can get a better coverage, right? The question is only, firstly, whether the passengers will now have a preference to connect. Mm-hmm. That's a big question. And second, will it be necessary? Will it actually be necessary if we now see the restructuring of networks where pretty much every airline, rather than operates a hub, basically increases the number of destinations? Can happen on sort of non-direct non-stops, then we may not see the hub advantage. We might actually see shift to point, but with a larger point-to-point network coverage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I've got an interesting one here for Jan. So as domestic or intra-regional markets are expected to ramp up earlier, what can full-service carriers with heavy focus on long-haul operation do to support their bottom line? Actually, it's probably for both of you. Will we see some new forms of full-service carrier, low-cost carrier partnerships? So I suppose, do you want to go first, Jan?
Yeah, I can do this. It's a very good question, and obviously this is now predicting the future with a lot of uncertainty. I think that, and we have seen that to some extent in the Gateway, what used to be Gateway Connects. I think that's also still existing, and the EasyJet Worldwide by EasyJet is that in that part not only low-cost carriers participated, but also full-service carriers. I think Emirates is also participating in there. So obviously, if low-cost carriers can provide feed to long-haul airlines, and that means not significantly deviating from the low-cost carrier business model, adding additional cost and complexity. If they can this essentially outsource this to airports, to companies that essentially facilitate and identify these connections. There's Kiwi, there's Dohop, Air Blackbox working on this, and I think yes, that could be an outcome. I would not like to give an estimate of how likely this is, but definitely I think partnerships in all forms are interesting and should be at least evaluated and strategically assessed by airlines.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add, Serge?
Yeah, I mean, all we might see, what's the difference if we're talking about the short-haul domestic markets? What's the actual difference between the full-service carriers and the low-cost carriers at the end of the day? I mean, we will definitely see full-service carriers reducing their costs as much as they can. Will there actually be any incentive for them to partner if they can basically operate the same network and reduce the cost to the level that where they can compete with the low-cost carriers?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a good question about government's role in this whole thing. Yeah, so many. I'm just trying to pick out a variety of topics. So here's one that says, do you see a threat in the way governments help their airlines at the moment? We are currently seeing it with KLM and Air France is putting pressure on Air France to cut jobs. The relationship between both airlines has not been the easiest, both airlines. So, yeah, do you think partnerships will likely profit from the crisis, given the example of KLM and Air France, and also the threat in the ways that the governments help their airlines at the moment?
I definitely see that it can be both. It can be opportunities, it can be threats. Obviously, Air France, KLM, the example here for the airline group, that's obviously a threat. Usually, I would say as soon as governments, politicians get involved, this essentially bringing in a third stakeholder into the partnership game that can have significantly shifts from what used to be the, let's say, mapped out partnership strategy. So I think again it remains to be seen what has happened there. Will be interesting if we come back in, let's say, 2 years' times from now and see how this all plays out.
Yeah. Another really good one, as airlines might reduce their network to different extents, do you foresee airlines to shrink their portfolios of partners also and just rely on the very big key big partners at large hubs to cope with staff and cost reductions?
To some extent, that might happen, especially when you shrink your network and the networks do not overlap anymore, or to not the extent that is required to one of your partners. To some extent, it will also depend on how efficiently airlines are managing their partnerships, how expensive these partnerships are. Sometimes I feel like people forget, they think of partnerships, and partnerships are always beneficial, and obviously they come with a certain price tag. And I think what airlines should do, it should be on the medium to long-term agenda. Airlines should reassess their strategy, their partnership strategy, and their partnership portfolio, because it has to be seen how the industry comes out of this, how your partners come out of this industry. Will they be the same? Will they be somewhat different? Will they be radically different? And how different you are. And then, yes, I think that we will see some partnerships ending, but we also might see some partnerships being forged that prior to the crisis, we have never thought they could happen. Because obviously, as I said in the beginning, when times are not so rosy, people stand together, partnerships become more important, and maybe what were, let's say, former fierce competitors, they might see the need to partner in future.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. There's an interesting comment here, which I think I already know the answer. If international flights are taking a longer time to resume and domestic flights will come back earlier, this will not benefit partnerships to increase the market coverage?
In the short term, I would agree. In the long term to medium, I mean, we all hope that that pandemic is over sooner than later. People will want and will need, probably first some will need to fly internationally, and then people want to fly internationally for vacation, for visiting family and friends. So I think there is potential for partnerships to be, as I said, even more important after the crisis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. I'm just reading, there's a couple of questions to do with the partnerships and the role of governments also. So I'll just read this out. In the short term, with governments paying airlines to fly and maintaining a cooperation in terms of skeleton flight networks, how will profit revenue sharing JV partnerships be affected? And what is the potential for hub consolidation in Europe given the proximity of these major airports?
That's a very good question. That's actually something I had addressed on the JV slide that we now, due to the time constraint, I apologize for that, we skipped. But I think, as we said earlier, it will be a stress test for the partnership. It will be a stress test for the industry. Partnerships, I think it will particularly be a stress test for joint ventures, because joint ventures are very complex commercial agreements with very sophisticated, very detailed, long discussed profit or revenue sharing mechanisms. And of course, they have foreseen certain things to happen, like strikes and maybe other forms of interruptions in the industry. But I'm pretty sure, not knowing any of the joint venture commercial agreements, I'm pretty sure that nobody has foreseen the crisis that we have seen now. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with that when, let's say, you have to fly with a 10% load factor long haul because your government mandates that, and then you essentially present the bill to your joint venture partner and you have to split? Well, if there's no profit, then you have to split the cost. So again, and also keep in mind, besides the long-standing transatlantic joint ventures, this is the first crisis that many of the recently formed JVs have to go through. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely joint ventures have all the capabilities to deal best with the crisis. They can coordinate more, they have antitrust immunity, so they can react much quicker and much more aligned than any other form of partnership can do. But they have to endeavor the crisis first, and the partnerships have to.
Yeah, I think the revenue sharing and profit sharing models will be very much challenged with this new situation. I would be surprised if any of them would be functioning as intended. They'll probably all have to be renegotiated. It will be very difficult. There will be very, very strong influences, passenger preferences. I think pretty much every single JV model will have to be reviewed following this crisis. It will help airlines, of course, if they're able to coordinate their schedules, but highly unlikely that they will be happy with the way revenue and profits will be shared.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. I think we have just enough time for one more question, and this is a big one. With all these governments helping airlines around the world, do you think politics will drive partnerships going forward?
I think that is quite likely to happen. Again, it depends on to what extent the politics, the governments interfere. Some will support their airlines financially. Some will, create the environment, create the vision for their airline industry, but they will remain out of, let's say, the day-to-day business, which I think is the most preferential option for the industry. But in some areas, they will be probably interfere also with certain, partnership, and they will drive the partnership strategy. They might drive the partnership portfolio, and that's obviously very dangerous, because just because two governments are friendly, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a beneficial partnership for, let's say, two state-owned airlines. So yes, it's a threat that I think is remain to be seen how likely this is, but if this comes into play, that could have a significant impact.
There's another thing there that's actually quite important. You have to keep in mind that every single government in the world will be going into massive debt following this crisis. And obviously part of that money that they have to borrow will now go to the airlines. They will seek to get that back in a few years' time. That's usually what happens. Governments borrow in a crisis, bail everybody out, and then they seek to sell them again in 2-3 years' time when they have to repay that debt. So they will have to be very careful with all that interference, that they don't firstly damage the profitability of an airline going forward, because they'll have to sell it ultimately, and also not to basically aggravate the partnership situation, because it might well be these partners that they will be selling it to. Mm-hmm. So that's something that hopefully most governments will have in their minds before they start influencing too much how these partnerships and generally how the airlines will operate their business.
Yeah,
very
good point. Thanks for your very interesting questions. Thanks, guys, for answering the questions. I believe we just have run out of time today, unfortunately. But as mentioned earlier, if you have an open question that you'd like to discuss further obviously please get in touch with us and we would be more than happy to help. Just a very quick word before we close off today. We see 3 phases in a prolonged crisis management cycle: hibernate, survive, and restart. We see this crisis as the best opportunity to revamp your organization, to make it more efficient and lean. If you would like to find out more about how we can help, please reach out to us, and we're very, very happy to discuss this further. And with that, we would like to thank all of you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Great pleasure to talk to you.